Good evening, very warm welcome to PAF, to this third event we're organizing with a lecture of Jos Boys. We're very happy to have her, and afterwards a conversation about an inclusive architecture sector. My name is Evelien Pieters, and PAF is building a feminist architecture community where women and everyone who feels connected to this issue can share their experiences about architectural practice, explore the underlying structures and mechanisms we see, and where we can also dream about a more inclusive sector. The starting point is the fact that, as you all know probably, the architectural practice in Belgium and beyond still isn't gender balanced, despite decades of equal numbers of female and male architects graduating. If we filter the percentages of the female architects by age that are working now in architectural practices, we clearly see a pattern that we call the leaky pipeline. This is the phenomenon that far more women than men leave the design practice during their careers. And next to gender, there's also a lack of diversity in the architecture sector. We unfortunately have little statistics on this, but we know this all too when we go to lectures and events in the architecture sector. PAF is a 1.5-year project where we organize a series of events, live and online conversations like this one tonight. And we also have a book club on feminism and architecture. And we plan to have in a year, 1.5 years, to end in a manifesto as a collage of experiences, insights and knowledge we have gathered along the way, aiming to build a more inclusive sector. At the beginning of March, we already we started, so just a month ago, with our first start events. These were community talks. Some of you were there. We talked in small groups about our experiences in the architecture sector, about inclusivity, sexism, norms and codes, the competitive work culture, and several more topics. And on March 15, we had a book club, and we talked about the book Making Space. That was written by Matrix. And tonight is a continuation of that with our speaker here tonight, who is now looking at my back, but unfortunately. The evening will consist of 2 parts tonight. First, there's the lecture by Jos Boys, and we have a Q&A with her afterwards, so we can ask her many questions as we like. And in the second part of the evening, we will continue the conversation in the room. We have 3 guests here that will join me here on the seats, but I would very much like it if you would all participate in the conversation in the second half of the evening. And we hope to end around 9:45. We're a bit late already, but that's how it goes. We will make it work. You can click a few slides if you want. So these are our partners. Stadsvorm is a very important one. We are here tonight, very happy to work with them. Yes, you can continue. So the events we had, and already some events coming up. And this was on the evening we have for you. And then we start with the main event of the evening, the lecture by Jos Boys. She is one of the founding members of the Matrix Feminist Design Cooperative. Matrix was a London-based collective, a feminist architectural practice, active in the 1980s mainly, and one of the first worldwide to bring issues of gender center stage to the design for the built environment. Jan, maybe we can already bring Jos onto the screen as I introduce her. Hello. The collective, I'm going to stand here now because then I'm talking more to you too. The collective wrote the groundbreaking manifesto Making Space, Women and the Man-Made Environment, which was published in 1984, I just mentioned it, and it was republished last year. In addition to her role at Matrix, Jos remained active in research and teaching on topics concerning feminism and inclusion in architecture. She was director of the Learning Environments, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Center at the Bartlett UCL. And in 2008, she co-founded the Disordinary Architecture Project, a platform led by people with disabilities that radically reimagines accessibility and inclusion in the built environment. I hope this is all correct, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. And tonight, Jos will speak to us about the work of Matrix and feminism in architecture. Jos, the digital floor is yours.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context in which Matrix operated, and then a little bit about how that context has or hasn't changed. I'm sorry, I don't normally have a problem with sharing my screen, but something, it crashed, so let's try it again. Yes, I'm afraid you're going to have to, because it's it crashed completely, so I'm going to have to reload it. Okay, I hope you can see that, and I hope you can hear me. You'll tell me if you can't. So the thing I wanted to start with, really, as I said, I wanted to explore a little bit about the context in which we operated, how it came to happen, Matrix, but I also wanted to start, because for me it's very important, it was a very diverse group of women who did many different things and had many different relationships to the organisation, and really that's something that we came to understand when we began to develop the online archive, as well as thinking about reprinting the book. And it's also true that, and we still, I think, didn't necessarily ever find everybody who was involved, because we don't really have records. It's also true that it's very much an accident that it's me talking to you. I happen to be the one who had availability for kind of developing the archive and working with many of the other women involved in doing an exhibition at the Barbican Centre. So we're all very much different voices, and that's true throughout. It's really obvious, but sometimes because it has this collective name, people will assume that we kind of all agreed to the same thing. So this is the original practice design group. We did initially, we just kind of played around with doing projects before it became formally a design practice under Matrix. So this is some of those women, and women who had other kinds of relationships, either because they worked on the book or because they were part of a kind of group giving solidarity and also expertise, women who were already in practice who supported Matrix. And really the thing that we've met on and off over the years, and we've been thinking about trying to get the book republished for years, really. And then two of the women in this group, Julia and Sue, the two women on the edge, both died quite soon after each other of cancer, and that kind of focused the mind a little. But it's also true that there were many other women involved throughout the kind of 10 years that the practice ran. This is a group from a later photo of the design team. You can see that the personnel has changed almost entirely. And these women were working in much tougher financial and political times. They had a much harder time of it. So one of the things that's been wonderful for me being involved in revisiting Matrix is to meet women like Gozi and Anne and Mo, who I didn't really know in those earlier periods because I wasn't, by then I wasn't working for Matrix. It's also true that the women involved, the many different women involved, went on to do other things. So the way that they developed their practice varied a lot. Some of that was in academia, some of it was in practice. Some women left completely, architecture completely, and went and did other things related to art practice or building work. So I guess I'm just, it's this big network of connections, both at the time and through time, and that's very important to me. You may have seen the online archive. It's still very much a prototype. We've run out of money and it's just finding the time to do it. But the aim is to put together, to have a kind of an open access resource that kind of also mirrors the way that Matrix works. So there are a whole series of, everything on it is free to download, and is at relatively high resolutions depending on what we've been able to find. And the aim is that different people take that off in different directions and make use of it as they want. And as I mentioned, and again, you may or may not know, part of this grew out of the request to have an exhibition about Matrix at the Barbican, which was planned initially through the pandemic, so it was quite complicated. And that too had a huge number of different people involved. I want it to be really clear that these networks have been absolutely vital to making things happen. The book's already been mentioned, and of course I'm going to do a plug. The Verso republished it recently as a feminist classic, which has been amazing. And I guess what I want to do is think about that, why that book still has some resonance, but also what we were trying to do in the 1980s when a group of us wrote chapters for it and wrote some shared chapters. So the context is very much 1980s second wave feminism in the UK, particularly in London. And this kind of stereotype, the housewife, the white housewife, who middle class, who between the wars would have had servants, and then through the kind of development of labour-saving devices became this kind of, there was this kind of imagery of what being a housewife was, that you could wear this amazing evening dress and somehow your cooker would do all the work for you. And I think what was interesting to us is that stereotype was already not true. It wasn't really even true for our parents' generation, but it certainly wasn't true for us. We were a group of, initially anyway, white middle-class women coming into architectural education in much larger numbers than had previously been there before. And the kind of nuclear family was anyway not so central to us. So part of what I think was interesting was how these kinds of stereotypes continued way past their reality, and in different ways I think we all reacted and responded to just how strong those stereotypes continued to be. And part of that was, at the core of second wave feminism, including its tendency to focus on white middle class women and the problem of the housewife, but it was lumbering around ungainly like in borrowed concepts which did not fit the shape we feel ourselves to be. And I think that very much sums up what it felt like at the time, but also I think there are elements of that still today. And so that meant there were a whole range of different things going on in 1970s and 80s London. There was a lot of feminist campaigning. There was a lot of squatting. London was completely derelict. When I went to architecture school in the 1970s, most of London was falling down. People squatted, and people used squatting. Women used squatting as a way of developing new ways of living, really. So there were quite a lot of lesbian collectives, for example, different ways of managing beyond the kind of nuclear family. And some of those women definitely, some of the women in Matrix had come that route. They'd studied some other subject. They'd got involved in squatting and housing and self-help and building, and they'd become very interested in design. So there was a very strong link. But at the same time, a lot of architectural practice in London at that period was also quite radical. There was a group called the New Architecture Movement, which was looking at unionising architects, and they produced this regular magazine called Slate. And there were groups, for example, this was the Architectural Association, run by Brian Anson. If crime doesn't pay, where do architects get all their money? So there was quite a lot of community-based action too. There was quite a lot of there was a kind of milieu where lots of these things were in the air and people were trying to work them out. There were also campaigns to stop the driving of a motorway right through Covent Garden, which a lot of us got involved in, and in replacing housing with office blocks. So there was a lot of community action with very strong tenants' organisations. To talk a little bit about Matrix and the different things that it did, I'll go through those. I think, first of all, and this was very much part of the book, although the different chapters were written really based on the kind of different interests of the various young women involved. But as we went off to architecture school, it was assumed that the built environment was completely neutral. And so one of the things we wanted to do is just work out in what ways, given women's roles, the built environment actually really acted quite inequitably on people, and both by gender, but also by race, by class, by sexuality, so that we just wanted to really try and work out what was going on in that period, and sexism was not a word that existed. So we worked together as much as anything in our different ways to try and think that through. And when we looked for what there was written that supported us, there was material from the States, histories, really interesting different kinds of architectural histories, and there were geographers. There was a lot of really interesting feminist work going on in geography. And those really, we searched out those books. We were just searching out anything we could find that would help us work out how to talk about architecture in particular. This, for example, these diagrams were ones that we were taught. This was one's called Space in the Home. I can't remember what the other one's called, but they were kind of housing manuals. They were guides for architects to design housing estates. And the one on the left, you can see, is just very much this stereotype of the housewife, the woman who's in black, in a black dress. She never really leaves the centre of she's almost entirely in this one place by the sink, except when she's using the Hoover or she's pushing the pram. And the other members of the family come and go around her. So there's a kind of, and it was used as a way of literally designing the interiors of the house. And the one on the other side is an image from a housing layout guide, which worked on the kind of assumption that the way that people navigated space was by looking for something that was interesting. And so here we have an image which says, by making a deliberately hidden corner, it says to us, come in, this may lead somewhere, there may be an exit. Whereas, of course, what it actually says is, this looks quite dangerous. I don't know what's around the corner. So it was a kind of complete misunderstanding, I don't think just of gender, but of the way that people experience space and what clues it gives them. I love this picture of the Matrix book, the original one. This was the copy that was at the Bartlett School of Architecture from when it was first bought, and I love it because you can see that it's very well read. Interesting that the Bartlett School of Architecture never bought a second copy, but it is it's got markings all over. It was, luckily somebody stole it from us in the library for us. I shouldn't say that out loud. It has all sorts of, people have marked all over it. They left things in it. It just shows the glory of when something's really been read almost to destruction. Other things that Matrix did, we were really interested in a kind of in debates, in extending debates and organising events and discussions with women, some about professionalism, some about architectural education, some about the relationships between design and building. And in fact, that connection, I think that was a very strong connection, which I don't think really has been carried through. Women in the manual trades still exists, and some of the first jobs that Matrix did were for Lambeth and Southwark's women's workshops, which were about training women in building skills, and several of the women in Matrix also studied a craft, so they were joiners or bricklayers. And there was a sense that all the different jobs in the world of making buildings were jobs that were possible for women and should be, that women should be, who might become technicians or surveyors or work on site, that was also a really important network. The other thing that happened, it wasn't designed by Matrix, but several women involved in Matrix also taught on a kind of foundation course at one of the local universities, Women into Architecture and Building, which was a foundation course to get more women into not just studying architecture, but working in the building trades. Pretty good on publicity, actually. Lots and lots of different leaflets. We still have some of these. And then I guess the main thing that Matrix is known for, and rightly, is the way that it worked with community groups. So this is a model of Dalston Children's Centre, which was a conversion of an old bathhouse. And by using really quite large-scale models with movable parts, one of the things that was possible to do was to make it feel very real what you were doing, but also make it very easy for community groups to play around with those models and work with the architects. We also did lots of things around scale, around understanding the scale, so always connecting the scale of a design to the room that people were in, really explaining, it's in the book, I think really wonderfully explaining how plans and sections and elevations work. Understanding that architecture has its own arcane language and that it's really important that that gets shared. And one of the, I was just going to mention a couple of projects which you may know. One is Jagannarii, which was an Asian women's centre in East London. This is Sophia Alman with Annie Thorne. This is from the film Paradise Circus. And I love this bit because Sophia says, we were an all-female group and we wanted an all-female architects practice. And we went with Matrix because they were just so professional. And at that point, Annie gives this kind of laugh. She kind of goes, which I think is very sweet. And that really did exploit a whole range of these kinds of design techniques. So this is a photograph from what was called a brick picnic, where everybody went off and looked at different buildings and looked at the colour of the bricks and looked at the mortar and discussed choices and how you made choices about that. And these are some images from Jagannarii itself. The metal screening is both to kind of reflect something of South Asian building types, but not in any way to have any particular religious iconography, but also very practically, it was a time in London, particularly the East End, where there was a lot of firebombing of Asian people, so it was also protection. This is another project done much later in the process, which was a women's refuge, and it was a building that had been had already been designed by, and I have to say, it was the clients, the refuge, were very angry with what their male architect had given them, because he designed a very institutional building. And Matrix came in to kind of refit the building in a way that was much more, that kind of understood much more what it was like for women and children escaping domestic violence. And so the model making thing is still the same. But in terms of the kind of funding and access to the building's occupiers, the possibilities for Matrix were much reduced compared to some of the earlier work. And that's what that conversion looked like. And that's just to give you an example of this way of working. So rather than a kind of one huge institutional kitchen, the Matrix designed with the client these kind of semi-separate areas so that less women could work together. There would be 2 or 3 women and their children would have a kind of unit to cook together or cook separately if they wanted. This is our Wikipedia page. It's kind of, I don't know how to explain how weird it is being part of this and then having it suddenly very popular all over again. But it's quite nice to have a Wikipedia page. And as I mentioned, the exhibition was very popular and very well used, and again reflected in the way the space was designed, the idea that it was very easy to just hang out there, use it in different ways. It wasn't just necessarily that you were there to look at the show. People definitely went just to have a rest with their children. And that's led to a whole series of connected exhibitions, some of which have been developed by people just doing what we thought they would, which is downloading stuff from the archive and then making their own exhibitions, which is really nice, but also some quite official ones in very official places. And part of the development of the archive is this notion that over time it might be kind of expansive and developmental. So, you know, I don't think any of us see Matrix as being foundational in any way. I think we feel like it's an example from which it's interesting to think about what other things are going on, the relationship between them, and what was possible, what the kind of changing gaps and opportunities are. So we're always asking people to just add posts about aspects of what they're doing that connect to Matrix in some way. And we're also trying to just reference the kinds of various networks happening everywhere. So I will be asking PAF to put something in here. And I mentioned that the exhibition has led to some rather more official ones. This is Lubaina Himid, who's a brilliant artist and who's doing a touring show at the moment in this country called Found Cities, Lost Objects, Women in the City, which has quite a large Matrix element to it. And here are some other ones which just show the kind of range and type of way that people have done it. Very nice, really, to see. So, what has changed? What is, where are we now? I mean, I'd be really interested to know about the specific situation in Belgium. In the UK, it feels like some things have improved. These are both images about women and women as architects, but also images about architects, about how much architects do or don't, how much they're trained not really to listen to their clients and users very well. And the photograph in the middle of the woman sitting on the bike rack, for me, that's very influential in the type of work that I do now around disability and different kinds of bodies and minds, is how we go on valuing certain sorts of people and not others. So even though I'm a great fan of cycling, and I think it has great benefits, it's very interesting that other alternatives like better public toilets, certainly I'm talking about the UK here, or more places for old people to sit down comfortably rather than having to hack the cycle racks, is just shows us something about what has and hasn't changed, I think. What I think is amazing is the extent to which there are a huge number of really vibrant groups working. The top two images are the work that Anne Thorne, who was really an important founder of Matrix right at the beginning and in the early periods, she went on to run her own practice called Anne Thorne Architects, and the housing scheme on the right, which is a scheme for older people's housing, has just been built. So there's still a huge, a women-only practice that's still making amazingly strong work. But there are also, and again, it may be very much similar in your experience, there's just a fantastic range of groups. I've just put in Black females in architecture. I put in Miket because I just think they're so interesting. But then, there's also the just ongoing work of MUF. And most recently in this country, I think there's been a real revisiting of issues around unionisation and the low pay of architectural workers. And ufvAb SAW, I think, is just a really fantastic, the way that they think about that, I think, is really powerful. Sound of Ice, another black-led, really, you know, sort of architectural but not architectural element. So I guess, I think what's really interesting is that there's still a huge amount going on, but perhaps it's harder. I think we had, because we were squatting, because we weren't, you know, we didn't have to pay out huge amounts of money to live. We had a lot more flexibility of what we were able to do. And we were also in a context where there was a lot of government funding that could support community groups. So there were things that were definitely easier than I think in the current day. And that's something I'd really like. It'd be really nice to discuss that with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jos. A lot you discussed a lot different things in a short amount of time, and I'm very curious if there are people here to start us off with some questions. Is there anyone who already has? Then I'm gonna. As mentioned before, we read the book 2 weeks ago with our book club, and I'm searching. Oh, that way, I'm going the wrong way. And we also prepared some questions with the book club in advance. So I'm coming to you, Tom. You were there in the book club, and here you are.
Hi, Jos. I'm not sure if you can see me.
No, yeah, if you lean in like that, that's brilliant. I reckon.
Hi.
And I just realised I'm getting darker and darker because I forgot that it would be getting dark by the end, but never mind.
Well, thanks a lot for the talk. Something we discussed at length in the book club was the fact that as architects, we are very much trained as problem solvers, an attitude which is also expected from us in practice. So we're not really used to or trained to question a project's brief, let alone the kind of broader social, political order in which we operate, and of which gender equality is part. And as Making Space quite explicitly describes, as problem solvers, as architects, we tend to affirm the social order and not really question it. We have a reflex to try to solve complex problems with elaborate, objective, so to speak, checklists. And I think in the introduction in Making Space, sorry, you very explicitly mentioned that you don't want to produce this kind of checklist, and you want to problematize this context around you first. And so Matrix was this quite unique combination, I think, of being a design collective, maybe more problem-solving oriented, but at the same time a very explicitly political project. It's a bit hard to make or to produce kind of very specific question around this, but it was a topic that interested us a lot and that was kind of very hard to tackle. So I was just curious about kind of your thoughts around this tension between the architect as problem solver and the political awareness. I think what came very explicitly forward in the book was that this kind of attitude drove the practice towards more process-oriented practice. So is this a kind of evolution that you would push more in general? Do you think we all need to be a bit more political aware in order to produce a gender inclusive environment? Do we all need to be a bit less solution-oriented? I'm not sure if that's fair to be so broad, but I'm sure you have some thoughts on this. Thanks.
Thank you. No, I think that's a really good set of comments, because I do agree that you know, the solution and checklist driven approaches are a really big part of the problem towards moving towards inclusive architecture. I mean, when I remember giving talks about matrix, and the first question would always be, what does a feminist architecture look like? And this was not a philosophical question. You know, this wasn't where might we go with this? It was much more, show me what I have to do and I'll do it. Just tell me what it looks like and then I can do that too. So I think that it is, for me, it's actually, the first thing is that it's a deeper problem within architectural education and practice, that partly because of the way that the profession has developed over the last, 100, 200 years, is there's no built-in time to reflect. There's no time often to get a deeper understanding of kind of the complexities of human occupation. And so it's very easy just to reproduce social norms, or to just meet kind of clients or your own assumptions about the world and your own privilege, really. And for me, that is part of a bigger issue around how we come to value particular kinds of bodies and minds. Like, there's a kind of type of person you're meant to be. You can tell me if this is different in Belgium, but I don't think it is. You're kind of taught to be obsessive, checklist and solution-driven, sort of autonomous, prove your competencies, act very quickly, be entrepreneurial, be single-minded, be energetic, be able to work at all hours of the night or day, be unencumbered. You know, there's a kind of ideal type which almost nobody matches. And that type, that brings with it a whole set of ways of operating, which I think are really problematic. They already make it harder to be working inclusively or to develop inclusive spaces. So I think I agree with you completely about the solution-driven thing, and I feel like it's part of a much bigger set of things that drive us in that direction and make it impossible, in day-to-day practice or even in day-to-day education, to do anything that's very radical unless you happen to have a really amazing client. So I think that brings, the second point for me is we really need to be investigating our own modes of practice more. And I think there's definitely some lessons to be learned from Matrix about that. How can we organise a way that builds in time and resources for kind of slower and deeper development processes? My daughter, who works in Australia, has a company where they try and model best practice, and they work 4-day weeks, and they give a percentage of their profit to good causes, and they set aside times for reflection and development, and all of that's doable and they still earn a good living. So there are models, I think, of working differently, and it's just we've got caught, and there may be people here in the room who are working in that way, but it's like we're caught in this kind of machine that just insists on keeping up this. It's like if you're working really hard and at pace, that somehow that indicates quality. There's a kind of connection made there that you must be obsessive, otherwise you're not very good. So I would really like to investigate all that. And I think that, Matrix was the context also made it possible because the local government, the Greater London Council, also funded feasibility studies for community groups, for underrepresented groups, which meant that there was money to sit down with user groups and talk through what they wanted and actually help them increase their ambition and come up with better projects. It also involved helping them with funding bids and all that kind of work. But that was always a first stage, and that was a funded stage. And then those, once they'd got planning permission, they might end up being built by somebody else. But it meant that the whole network of community-based practices were able to survive very well because they could be doing that kind of work, development work, as well as actual projects. So I feel like, I feel a little shocked actually that how little of that, I feel like some of that does still seem quite the way that the participatory methods, for example, do still feel quite radical. Now that I'm part as co-director of the Disordinary Architecture Project, which brings disabled artists and architects into architectural education and practice to kind of co-develop and co-think different ways of doing inclusion in a very creative and critical way. We've, for 15 years, we've been working in a kind of, we do workshops which are discursive and developmental, and the design emerges from them. And we've just been doing a series for a project we're doing for the London Festival of Architecture this year. Maybe 3 groups of 20, so 60 people. And not one of them, and most, there are a lot of them are architects, not one of them had ever worked that way before. They all found it, they just thought it was extraordinary. I'm like, it was what Matrix was doing. It's kind of maybe it's just the time and the finances have stopped that being possible, but it felt quite odd how few people had ever experienced that kind of way of working. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
It was also a very long question, so with a lot of layers, so great. Thank you very much. I'm looking around. In the meantime, is there someone else? It can also be something completely different. Don't hesitate. We still have prepared questions in our back pocket, so no problem. I'm going to Sophie. You were also part of the book club, and you were also here at the first event of PAF. So I'll hand you the mic for the second question.
Hi Jos, thank you for the talk. My name is Sophie, and in the book club we talk quite a bit on architectural education and the role of the architect, and how the topics in the book have or haven't changed in the last 40 years. And as an architecture student myself, I still recognize some of the topics, like the small percentage of female professors, the need to prove yourself time again and again, and the competitive atmosphere. Many of the mechanisms described in Making Space are still responsible today for the so-called leaky pipeline, or the high dropout rate of women designers over the course of their careers. You was a professor at the Bartlett University College in London, and that's also the university where you've studied. So my question is, have you seen an evolution in the architecture education, and what advice would you give to me and to the many other students in the room tonight?
Thank you. Also a really great question. Certainly for me, studying at the Bartlett School of Architecture in the 1970s, it was a very different place. And I guess, again, I just have to say, obviously, that different architecture schools often have very different kinds of cultures. But in the 1970s, the Bartlett was, we did a lot of community-based action. They had done research that proved there was not a relationship between the score you got in your school exams and how well you did in your undergraduate course. So you didn't have to, the requirements to get in were just the basics to get into any university. There was no elitism, which meant that it was quite, it wasn't very competitive. It didn't have a competitive atmosphere. It was quite relaxed. The tutors weren't necessarily very good, but it was just a very different feeling when I was, when I was teaching Bartlett architecture students, normally for their history dissertations, the kind of stress that people were under to compete in this kind of elitist world and produce huge amounts of work was extraordinary. I mean, I was working with them on the dissertations, and their design tutors were telling them that this wasn't really very important. So they were literally shaking with stress. They were kind of like, oh, I've got to have this tutorial, but really I need to get back to my design project. And it just felt really scary. And as some of you may know, the Bartlett School of Architecture had a lot of issues recently around racism and sexism. And to their credit, they did a report which is online. You can, they made it public. They didn't try and hide anything. And for me, that the problems they've been having are very much connected to the UK context, and as much about class and elitism really as about racism and sexism, although those things definitely come into it. So there's a kind of reproduction of privilege and white privilege and white male privilege and white male able-bodied privilege that benefits some and not others. So in terms of that limited experience of the Bartlett, and in fact, I worked in another school, the School of Sustainable Construction, and I did resign and left in December because of staff-on-staff bullying. So, and some just some really problematic behaviour. So that stuff still seems to go on. It's again, I find it shocking that those kinds of behaviours are still validated, and that institutions will, universities will, reputation management is more important to them than equality in educational access and experience. And I guess the other thing is, I feel like there's, and again, I'd really like to know, from you, whether this is something you're experiencing. For me, and relatively recently, the kind of individualistic neoliberal self-actualization model of the world seems really strong. And part of that, which is, it's still really important, it's not a criticism of it, but it is that a lot of the focus is on equal pay, getting more women into the profession, more equal opportunities towards leadership. So not changing the profession, but allowing more people, more women into it, and more women to do better in it. And I guess part of what Matrix was saying is we need to be really challenging the nature of the profession in a much deeper way. That doesn't mean we're not campaigning for those things as well. And I just have to read you a quote. I can't quite believe it. It's from a UK magazine called Building Design, which is like trade press, and it was for International Women's Day. And luckily I can't remember the name of the author, because it's just an extraordinary piece where you feel like it's almost like it must be a joke, because it's like being back in the 1970s. So this is just a paragraph from it, 2 paragraphs from it. The other day, I ran into my friend Eva Dirikna, also my professional role model, at Heathrow Airport. So this woman is an architect as well. Both of us were en route to site meetings overseas and sat together in the BA lounge and animatedly talk shop, as we love to do. Eva, like me, is a big champion of women in architecture. She believes that women that can stay the course really have the edge in this profession and tend to work extra hard to prove themselves more capable. I mean, I'd be interested again in what you think about that. But for me, that's an extraordinary thing to be saying now, 40 years on, that all those people who are underrepresented, whether you're a person of colour or a woman or gay or trans or from a working class background, the way you get on is you have to work twice as hard as the white men, and then you prove yourselves really capable, and then you'll be fine. Which just seems the most extraordinary thing to say. And then she says, indeed, studies have shown that the female brain is better equipped for multitasking than that of our male colleagues. Which is kind of, I could go on, the whole thing is like some sort of joke take, but it's not. So there's a kind of, that people can, that's for International Women's Day, that kind of way of writing about women in architecture can just be mainstreamed all over again is very shocking for me. And I think the big way to respond to that kind of neoliberal, individualistic, self-actualizing push is through consciousness raising. That's very much one of the great things I think of second wave feminism is coming together and realizing that you share a lot of similar experiences and that those are societal. They're not just to do with your individual failings. And I think it's something that's really fantastic. It seems to me that that's what PAF is. It's a consciousness raising. It has a consciousness raising role. And I feel like that's really important. So just to say, I think, in terms of what you do as a student, I think there are a lot of socially committed tutors, and you have to find them, you have to find good people, but I think you also can, it varies a lot from school to school and from country to country about how much you can demand to run your own studio projects, how much you can set up a breakaway group. I mean, that was happening when I was a student. How much student societies can organise radical lectures and workshops, things like this, you know, like the reading group. That those sort of student-led things seem to me to be the way forward. That's actually what we did. I think it came from us. It didn't really. Some of the community action came from our tutors, but the way that we understood it and the way that we explored it was very different. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's such great advice. Start your own groups. There are a lot of students here tonight. You maybe cannot see everybody, but I hope that's an interesting advice for you. I'm looking around if there are hands. Yes, here in front.
Hello, Jos. I'm curious about one thing. I would like to know what was the changing point for you to move from gender to disability studies in architecture?
That's a really good question, and I think I don't think that it was so much a changing point. I think it comes out of the same thing for me, and it's quite personal, which is curiosity. And I think in a way I got involved in feminism out of curiosity. It's like, wait a minute, what is going on and why is it going on? So some of it was stuff that I experienced as a young female, but some of it, you know, given that I'm also white, middle class, able-bodied, it was things that, you know, I also came with quite a lot of privilege that got me into architecture school in the first place. So a lot of it for me was just trying to work out how the world works in certain ways and not in others, and how that underpins perpetuating social norms and inequalities. And when it came to disability, so it was in kind of 2006, 2007, when I met a disabled artist called Zoe Partington, who'd been working in this field for a very long time. We had a coffee and we were ranting exactly the same. It was like, because I'd been doing some reading, I was trying to work out why disability was treated in this kind of, you know, like there was stuff that you could read about gender, about sexuality and architecture, about race. Stuff did exist. It wasn't, you know, there wasn't much of it, and you might not get it on your course, but it existed. But disability only existed through kind of design guidance and through this thing that you do with these templates at the end of your project. You know, you design for normal people, and then you have to adapt your design for the people you've already left out. It seemed like a really strange thing. It was like an anomaly to me. And the fact that disability was seen in this kind of completely ahistorical, asocial way, that it couldn't, you know, there wasn't an idea that it might be a place to start a kind of critical and creative critique of how society works, who's enabled, who's disabled, taking that in its wider sense, not just disabled people. And so it became a kind of, and Zoe and I were like, why is this still going on? You know, there was lots of campaigning. You know, there was the campaigning that produced the legislation in different countries across the States and the UK and Europe. But also like a huge amount of campaigning in the 1990s by disabled people, literally kind of chaining themselves to buses to improve public transport and literally breaking curbs on the road with a hammer, with a sledgehammer, and pouring concrete so that they could make a curb cut, make a slope. So there was all this stuff that was going on that kind of just, you never heard about it at architecture school. You might hear about other sorts of community action, but you didn't hear about how much, and the independent living movement. There was just so much. And it was kind of like, it just was boxed up and put away when it came to disabled people. And so Zoe and I were like, we're 40 years on, you know, we're 40 years on, and it's still, there is legislation and some things have got better, but generally attitudes and the way that designers think hasn't changed at all. So in fact, what we need is a different way of operating. And so that fed into some of the things that I'd been involved in relationship to Matrix that helped kind of form how that might work. So I think, yeah, it wasn't, it felt like there were lots of like gender, feminism, critical race studies, queer studies, you know, that there was stuff going on in architecture, and that it was really important that the brilliant work going on in disability studies scholarship, in disability arts, and disability activism should penetrate architecture and built environment education and profession. So it was a kind of, it just seemed like a really odd, the more you think about it, the odder it becomes, the way that we deal with it in architecture. Weird. And completely inequitable. Outrageous too. We should be angry. We should be really angry that we behave like that.
Can you maybe share a bit more with us on what your initiative, what you do with this initiative?
Yes. So it's the Disordinary Architecture Project. You can see our website, which is out of date, like everything of mine at the moment, because I don't have the time. But disordinaryarchitecture.co.uk, and we do a range of things. So we do a series of kind of foundational workshops. We call it embodied practice. Our idea that starts from the idea that we all bring our bodies and our minds to the way that we work and the way that we design and the way that we learn, and that part of the way that architecture works is it tries to kind of abstract that a bit. Like, you learn to be a certain sort of person and you sort of damp down the bits that don't fit the model. So in order to really understand the kind of way and enjoy and value the richness of our different neurobiodiversity, you need to start with exploring your own body and other people's bodies, and we do workshops where we get people, and they're all led by artists, so they're led by disabled artists, and it comes from their own creative practice. So for example, that might involve there's somebody called David Dixon who happens to have a prosthetic leg, and he plays around with the idea of just altering your body in different ways and using that as a way to change the way that you draw. So they're kind of, you know, they're very varied, and we do that, and we work directly with practices looking at how they might challenge their own assumptions about inclusion and look at different ways of changing that, and that includes having lecture series with disabled artists. We're just about to do it's our first, we're trying it out, a kind of walk and talk discussion about it through a building that the architects have done. Not to say they've done it wrong, and not to say, oh, this needs access and that needs access, but to explore the ideas around what it is that matters and how you design and what gets left out in that process. So it's a kind of, I'm not explaining this very well, it's kind of beyond access. We don't do access audits. We don't tell people, oh God, you need a ramp here and you need a lift there. We're much more interested in it building into our creativity and it informing us. And we're doing a couple of small design projects at the moment. So one is around the idea of deaf space and deaf gain with deaf architects and some other disabled artists. Because deafness, if you sign, there's something very powerful about the space, the kind of social spaces that get created around signing. It's a very performative way of being in the world. It's a kind of way of bringing embodiedness in a very beautiful way, I can't explain it, into space. And it also has lots of things to do with light and reflections and what you can see and how you can see it. It's a whole kind of, it's a whole way of thinking that's just different. And we do another project around called Architecture Beyond Sight, which is about what happens if you don't prioritize the visual in design. What does it mean? What other design methods could you use? Could you design a building just through audio description? Would that be, what would that be like? And we work with a lot of blind and partially sighted artists and architects for that. And we're also we're doing a project in London for the London Festival of Architecture with a group called Refabricate, who look at the waste economy, where we're trying to link together ideas about what counts as waste, who doesn't count. So waste as discarded things and materials, but also discarded people and what that might mean. And it's called Seats at the Table. So it's an idea. It's a whole series of different elements, which would take me rather too long to explain, that look at how you might really rethink accessibility at every level and treat it as a kind of creative, treat different disability and difference as a creative generator and as a way of critiquing societal norms. So it's a whole other thing. You'll have to, I'll come and talk, I'll come and visit you in Antwerp and give you the whole
Yeah, we have to do another lecture. No, but actually I wanted to say there are a lot of things I hear that seem to be a very straight line from things going on at Matrix of consciousness raising, embodiment, looking through different lenses at spaces, at the building design. Yeah. Great.
Absolutely, I do. I think that's, and for me, it's really interesting to fold it back too, to fold it back and think, what does it mean? What does this mean for feminism? And at one level, it means the extent to which, you know, it's an issue about the extent to which feminism does or doesn't think about different kinds of bodies and minds. But it's also about, exactly what kinds of overlaps and alignments there are. And there are many.
Yes. Anyone else? I know there's someone else who wants to ask a question. Erin?
My question is actually related to what you just said about feminism in general. So Matrix as a collective and the book-making space are clear products of the second feminist wave, where themes such as paid work and the housewife, critique on the housewife were central, but today the book and feminism remain relevant. As you also addressed, the question is often asked that if there is such a thing as female or feminist architecture. In the book club, we found those questions besides the point, and the purpose of the book, as you also stated in the book itself, and as you said in the lecture today. So we wanted to ask a different question for you. What is a feminist architectural practice? And what does it mean today? I think you already elaborated a little bit on that with your This Ordinary project. But also the question, if you can explain a little bit more what a feminist method can be. Do you see these participation processes in Matrix as a feminist method, or are there other feminist methods which you can talk about? So thanks.
Thank you. I think that's such a great question, and I think the Matrix growing out of second wave feminism, you know, it's both. It's really interesting what does resonate, and also I think, as I said, I think we have to be aware of how much the focus on the kind of middle-class white housewife was problematic, and something that needs to be revisited. I also do, I agree. I think it was very clear, I think, for Matrix and all the women involved in different ways that, you know, participation, just a kind of equality of participation and developmental processes was really central. But I think, I mean, for me, it's interesting because, again, I guess because I do see it in a historical context, I'm not sure I'm the person to answer that question, but I think for me, what's been interesting is how feminist architectural practice has changed, and also how other things have influenced architecture and the kind of issues that are coming up among younger generations who are being radical in a whole range of ways. So for me, the big change initially was a move towards much more artistic practice, you know, the kind of work of groups like MUF. It did work, bring together artists and architects, and kind of tried to soften the edges of what architecture was. And I think there's still a lot for me to reflect on that, about how we link art and architecture, because I think what's most interesting for the Disorderly Architecture project is a lot of our discussions are actually about the differences between artistic practice and architectural practice. They're not about disability or creativity, they're about what's going on there and what kinds of models are offered and why are they different, and how might you have something really enriched by art practice, but that also recognises that some of the things that the kind of forms of realisation that architecture has is very different. So I think there's still a lot to be learnt from MUF, and of course they're still going. And then I think for me, there's a lot still to be learnt from the pandemic, and to be learnt from the kind of mutual aid groups that got going among disabled people. There was most fantastic support networks had to develop because people were so at risk, and it meant that for a moment we thought quite a lot, I think, about interdependence, about vulnerability, about bodily difference, about mental health. And one of the things that Disordinary always says, and this comes from disability studies scholarship, is we all have access needs. It's just that the built environment that we have meets the ones of able-bodied white men and some women and some, so around class. So I think part of it was just, it's about trying to explore those models. I think are fantastic. Some of the mutual aid models that developed, and some of the more hybrid ways of working, both online and offline. I feel like there's something very rich in all of that, and in terms of thinking about radical and inclusive design, and it's going to be very easy just to forget it all and just to move on and go back to being competitive, energetic individuals who run everywhere and cycle everywhere and work hard and compete with other people. And that's something, if you're disabled, you often can't do. And if you're neurodivergent, then you may process things in a different way. Or if you need rest and recovery, you can't work those kinds of patterns. Or if you're partially sighted, and there's lots of partially sighted architects actually, you get more exhausted, you get more tired, but you have to pretend that you don't, because that's going to affect your career opportunities. So that's a very vague thing that I've said there, but I feel like there's some really important lessons to be learned. And then I guess the third thing, which I think Matrix did do, but I feel like we could go a lot further, and I think we're learning this from Disordinary, and I do hope, I'm planning to kind of think it back through in relationship to feminism. And there's a lot of really interesting work, as I think you said, and certainly others have said, around feminism and care and around the climate emergency. So there's kind of a lot of things going on, really important things that overlap and revisit the sorts of some of the issues that came up in second wave feminism. And I think for me, it really is about challenging the frameworks of architectural education and the profession itself. It really is thinking about all the different roles, architecture, building, surveyors, who's doing what. It's just a historical accident, and it's different, of course, in different countries. It's a historical accident how we come to have certain ways of doing things. But once we do them that way, and once we're educated to do them all way, so we get inculcated into them, they seem so obvious and normal that we don't revisit them at that level. We might revisit day to day, a little bit more participation here, but in terms of the structural underpinning of the profession and of its relationship to property, housing, land as an asset, its relationship to all those really difficult aspects of capitalism. So much to be looked at. And then I do worry, you've heard me say it really, I'm just repeating myself, professional behaviours. I think there is a way of being a professional which I find quite problematic, and it's been really interesting for me working with brilliant deaf and disabled architects, having worked with artists for 10 years, is they bring a way of seeing the world which is actually quite it's not always that open-minded. Doesn't mean that it's not really good, but it's very different, and it's quite challenging for this ordinary architecture project to think of how we value that range of different knowledge and skills. And then finally, in terms of challenging modes of practice, I've already mentioned it. We could be using so many different sorts of design methods. We use very highly visual methods. We still use, and this Matrix was saying this, we use plan sections, elevations. We use ways of dividing up the building, which are, you have to learn, and they help you unsee certain things, and they certainly don't capture anything to do with the sensory world. So those methods are really, we need a broader range of methods, I think, and Matrix is a really good place for that. But I also, we work sometimes with a architects practice called Manilow and White, and they won a design competition by doing it as an audio description. They audio described the building and what they were going to change to it. So they talked about it. They did it as an audio. They talked about it, and they also explained why, if you walk around the building and you explain what it's like, and then you think about how you might intervene, operating in that way actually opens up particularly all sorts of different senses, but it also opens up how it is that you imagine a space and how you describe it and how you imagine occupying it. And so from their point of view, they were arguing that it was a way of actually helping them to design better. So that, for me, is a really good example of the sorts of things that I'm saying about. And for me, that is a feminist design practice. It doesn't have, feminism on it. It's not about gender in particular, but it is about refusing the kind of societal norms and the kind of standard ways of doing things.
Thanks. That's so interesting that you're talking about questioning these norms, questioning the way we are in the profession. What I noticed a lot in initiatives that are going on now, there seems to be a lot of awareness that we're still not gender balanced, that there's a lack of diversity, a lack of inclusion in the architecture sector, and there are a lot of projects focusing on bringing role models into the spotlight, which of course is something we need in a way, because we miss, and what you don't see you can't be, or I don't know how you say it. But I'm also always a bit concerned when there's so much focus on projects like that, because it's exactly these structures we don't seem to question then that are. How do you see these kind of initiatives?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I guess for me, I mean, I was very influenced by the Black Lives Matter activities, because I think that what people of colour have been saying for a long time, and actually so have disabled people, less maybe women because of the way that we sit in society, but have been saying is the problem is not, you're not the problem as a person of colour. The problem is the white people and their assumptions and their privilege. And so actually the people who need to do the work, and I include myself in this, are all of us in the profession who are not, don't hit those categories, because we're the ones perpetuating assumptions that in the end do keep underrepresented groups underrepresented. And that Eva Jurichner quote, I shouldn't go on about it, but that if it's correct, saying that all women have to do is work harder, and then they'll prove how capable they are, then it'll all be all right. That's people of colour just need to work harder and prove how capable they are, and then it'll all be all right. So role models are people who have managed to achieve in the profession, and because they've managed to do all of that, and then they're like modelling that way of being. Whereas, why do you have to do that? Well, because the stereotypical white man, able-bodied man, middle-class man, just assumes that women are slightly less good at it, a bit silly, not really need to be listened to, need to have things explained to them. And I work with lots of people that I really like, but I can see that they just can't stop themselves assuming that women just aren't as capable. And they can't stop themselves assuming that people of colour don't really know what they're doing. And so that's what's got to change, to me. And that means us all looking at ourselves and just stopping that kind of behavior, just really recognizing our own unconscious biases.
That seems like such a good note to end on. But maybe we're not ending. If there's still a question, I'm very happy to give you the mic. And yes.
Hi, Jos. Thanks for having us. Just a quick question. Were you victim of invisibilization in the architecture world as woman practitioner? Because patriarchy obviously tend to put on the front of the scene more men than women. So were you victim of invisibilization with matrix and during your practice? And if yes, how did you deal with it through the media or something?
I'm sorry, because you're behind somebody else and Mike's not working very well. Can somebody just repeat that question for me, or summarize the question?
Yeah, so were you a victim of invisibilization as a woman practitioner by the media or the politics?
Sorry, a victim of the organization?
No, invisibilization.
I'm sorry that I'm not being able to hear properly. Can somebody else just...
So I guess you're asking, were you yourself a matrix also made invisible in the architecture sector? Is this what
Sorry,
you mean? Yeah.
I'm being really... Excuse me for being a bit deaf.
No worries.
It's an interesting point. I think we got dismissed a lot. We were not invisible to people who found us, who needed that. So we were invisible to some extent to mainstream architecture, but not to a lot of students coming through who really needed and enjoyed having different kinds of ways of working, seeing ways of working. But I also think, I'm just trying to think if we did it, if Matrix did it, and in terms of there's a whole thing about being on trend. So you're fashionable for a bit, and I'm fashionable at the moment, which is fine by me. I can exploit being fashionable. And so I think, so you have the opposite of being invisible, in that everybody wants you to give talks. I mean, this was true of Matrix too. Everybody wants you to kind of be there in your committees. This happens a lot with the Disorderly Architecture Project. We're like the token. There are other groups coming through now in the UK, actually disability-led groups, which is fantastic in architecture. But, so we're always being asked to be at events, just at the level of appearances, really. But, so I guess, I'm not explaining it right, but I think the thing is, if you get into this kind of work, it's a game you have to play. You have to exploit some of that tokenism, because you're reaching people who are not there because they just want to tick off the fact that there's been a woman speaking, or there's been somebody talking about disability, or here's a kind of radical new practice that we could just look at and then forget about. So you exploit those situations, and certainly in terms of funding, it's a way of hitting certain sorts of targets, and I'm quite happy to exploit those things. And certainly on behalf of the artists and architects that I work with, I will exploit everything that gives them increased visibility and increased influence. And I guess I think Matrix did. I think we were self-aware enough to know that that's also a kind of game we were playing, and that's just life. That's not. I'm not complaining about it. I think it's part of doing something that's out of the mainstream. You have to exploit the gaps and opportunities that the world offers you. I hope that answered that question. I'm sorry I didn't hear it properly.
Thank you so much. thank you very much, Jos, for your inspiring contribution to this evening. We have to say goodbye to you now. You have given us a lot to think about and to talk about, because we will continue the conversation here in the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'm sure, I'm sorry to miss the conversation, but I think it makes sense to have it with only people there in the room. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Yes, I want to welcome the guest for the second part of this evening to come and sit with me. And maybe take a glass of water. I will take mine too. Yes, I'll introduce our speakers to you shortly. Oh, there's some moving around. Just take your time in between. I'll keep talking about to introduce our speakers. Furthest from me is Li Mei Tsien. She's an engineer, architect, and urban planner. She studied at universities in Belgium, London, and Taiwan. She co-founded the firm, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I would say B612 Architects. Yes. Yeah? Because if I have to say a number like that in French, then that won't work for me. In Brussels, your practice is in Brussels. And besides your architecture practice, you are the chairwoman of the Union of Women Architects in Belgium, the ufvAb. Is the short to that. And next to that, you teach at Belgian universities and co-curate exhibitions in Belgium and abroad. Then we have Somaie Sedaghat Niai. Please. Niai, sorry. You studied architecture in Germany and also at the University of Antwerp. You wrote your master's thesis on the participation in urban planning of super diverse populations. And after your studies, you worked as a participation coordinator, and you also started your architectural internship. But then you decided to switch careers, and you changed to the care sector. And Somaie currently works as a care worker at Hubbie, an organization providing support to people with disabilities. And Eyukewe Dogo is a French-Belgian architect born and raised in France with roots in Togo. You worked in Belgium at various architectural firms for over 10 years, I guess. And you're now, very recently, you moved to the Netherlands, and you're a senior architect at UN Studio in Amsterdam. And your commitment to social change has led you to take up various positions inside and outside the field of architecture. We will hear about it more later too, but two of the things are that you are a board member for the Flemish Architecture Institute and for the Antwerp Pride. So you're still in Antwerp a lot too for these, yeah. All right, welcome. We've heard a lot already this evening. And I would like to ask you a bit more on your careers. To start with you, Li Mei. You founded your architecture office in 1997, if I'm correct?
Yes, 1997, right.
And together with two male partners?
Yes.
And you've also been involved with the Union for Women Architects of Belgium since 2002, you told me when we spoke before. So in these last 20 to 25 years, have you seen an evolution on women in architecture in Belgium and on the topics of inclusion and diversity in the architecture sector in Belgium?
Yeah, I think so. I think it has really changed. I would say, like Jos, that it's quite fashionable right now, and astonishingly, but good. Yeah. So I think this is the most important change, I think. Also, I think that the public entities, they start to care about that. So we start to see in the commissions that it is a subject. So I would also say that it's easier to talk about it. I myself have had a lot of difficulty, I think, to really assume that part of myself, that I've always been very schizophrenic about it, and it's kind of a change for me as well.
And can you say a bit more on that? How you've been?
I think it's linked with lot of things. Some are personal, and other are cultural, and other are the epoch that changed. So I'm Chinese. I'm raised as a Chinese girl, and I think that a lot of things that have been said this evening in the question, I think, resonate a lot with the question I've always had, but didn't really want to formulate. Maybe the fact that you're a girl, you're Chinese, so difference was always kind of part of the landscape. But back in the 90s, it was difficult to really claim for that or for something, and I wasn't like others a kind of fighter for that. So I was involved, but not, in French you say, monter aux barricades. So I was more like an observer and a participant in that thing. And also I think there was some kind of atmosphere that made you don't want to really put that face on top. Like, for example, when you're talking about working more, fighting, it was more about winning than sharing. And what we're trying to do now is maybe more sharing than winning. But you've got this, this competition, the fact that you need to be doing both, that you have to raise your kids and head your office, and that you always had to prove that you're not the secretary. And it takes some time to say, well, the hell with it. Take some time. I think it's also maturation with the age, and some change of time. And now it's less of a... Some of us at the ufvAb were saying, the oldest actually in the ufvAb, she said, back in the 90s is what a dirty word to be maybe feminist. So you were always like, am I feminist? Maybe it's kind of wondering. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I started studying in 2000, and you started with ufvAb in 2002, and you told me when we talked before about the things you were organizing then, which sounded to me like I would have wanted to know about when I was this young in architecture school. Can you tell something about
sure.
this?
So I kind of fell into the ufvAb because there was a group of women that were organizing exhibitions and conferences, and that were all the things I liked. And we actually, when I started, they had already organized exhibition with Zaha Hadid and a conference. And I had the opportunity when I started, we had a conference with Farshid Moussavi. And we made an event that was called Pluriel. And that was a play of word between pluriel, which means diverse, and the fact that the L means she. And it was what we wanted to do was showing already the different facet of what it could be to be a designer and an architect. And we were doing also a talk where we had a designer, an architect, and a fashion designer talking together about what they found creativity was, and how it was to work as a woman in a field that even for fashion was also dominated by men. And for me it was very interesting because I was as an engineer, I studied among boys. As a student, I was studying, I had more mathematics, so my class was mainly male. So people were asking you, so how does it feel to be a female architect? And you're like, well, actually, I don't know, because I'm working with the boys and I try to do the same as they do. And compete and do better, and and then you're like, oh yeah, okay. So actually, you realize that I never had the opportunity like Matrix to be a consortium of women, and maybe also out of curiosity, I started to participate because people were asking me, why were you doing that? My associates, they were always making fun of me. They was like, okay, you're a women thing. Why do you do that? And it was not easy to say, well, actually, it's interesting to see other people, but maybe just because I'm just wondering, when I'm working with you guys, I don't feel particularly that I'm special, but I'm wondering whether there are different ways, and we were talking about that with the girls as well. So, but we never really came out with an answer, and I think that the opinion are very diverse as well. Like when you say some of us we were talking once about Zaha Hadid, I think said, but I'm not sure anymore. But like I'm not a women architect. I'm not a woman architect, I'm an architect. And other was saying, okay, no, I want to be, I'm a woman architect. I'm just an architect. And then this kind of discussion amongst us, so we were not one voice, but we always appreciate that we were different voices, but raising the question was already interesting.
Yes. Thanks. Eyukewe, on to you. So as I've said before, you've worked in Flanders for 10 years. You were educated in France. You now live in the Netherlands. From all of these different countries and architectural sectors, do you see any differences in the way they deal with these topics of gender, of diversity, of inclusivity?
Yeah, kind of, but at the same time, also no. It's really kind of funny if you look at Belgium where I worked. Most of the offices where I worked were offices where they like to think that you're a family. It's a small group of architects. The firms are quite smaller also. Now in the Netherlands they are really corporate, big offices. A lot of people.
How
really
many people work at
your studio? I think we're like 350.
Oh.
350 with eight.
I don't even know if we have
8 offices in the world. There are like offices in Shanghai, Hong Kong, Dubai. It's a huge office. So yeah, really different, but at the same time, I just see the same patterns everywhere. So, and even the conversation that they have in the Netherlands, I think there are way more conversation about racism in the Netherlands than in Belgium. I think Belgium is still a really touchy subject, but for a lot of people. In the Netherlands, of course, it's also a touchy subject, but they have a community that is way more present and visible, at least in the Netherlands. Now in Flanders, we don't have it. I think they have it more in Brussels and Wallonia with the Congolese community, this French speaker. In the Netherlands, Suriname, they also speak Dutch, so they have a voice that they express. But yeah, the problems are the same, so it's really different, but it's also kind of the same. And I want to say it's kind of reassuring, but also not.
Reassuring in a bad
No,
way?
no, reassuring. I mean, I was thinking like it's more personal. It's like, yeah, I'm not lost completely.
And when we talked before, you said, well, now in this very corporate setting I work in now, very recently, so you're still getting used to it, I guess. But they kind of cannot be without a policy or an
of course. That's the fashionable way of doing diversity and inclusion. It's like there are nice words. There are nice words that everyone used at the time. Everyone loved them. Do they really understand what it is? I don't think so. I think diversity is way more easy to understand than inclusivity. But yeah, of course, they have diversity and inclusion officer that is working around those questions. because it's corporate and because we need to have one. It's nice to have something like that right now. It's marketable, but it's something also in Belgium that that it starts to come. So I worked before here in Antwerp for Bureau Bouwtechniek. I had some. I want to say, yeah. I met some racism there. But you know, the racism, I mean, there are different kind of racism. You know, there is the one in your face, the one that's saying like, you know, I don't like black people, I don't want to see them. This one I'm not worried about because I know who you are, you don't like me, it's fine, you're racist, next. But there is the institution, I mean, the one that we just have internally, the one that is insidious. This one is dangerous, and that's the one that I met quite some time. So I went to my direction. I said, okay, look, that happened. What are we going to do about that? So that they started a kind of a group within the office. They were helped with an external office as well in diversity and inclusion. But I think in a really good way. They started with like ask question in the office about security and feelings that people have. And yeah, I mean, it's really funny because some result came back, and the result, of course, we could. I mean, I think everyone already know, but yeah, women, the majority of them, apparently, yeah, they talk about the fact that maybe they don't feel all the time as secure that as men feel in the field. So yeah, I mean, the questions are present. I think people are trying to make a difference in different ways. But as Jos said, I think many times it's really about getting people to understand the problem. I think that's the first step that we need to do. We need to try to educate people to understand the problem, to make sure that they can understand their own biases and how we learn them.
It makes me think about something, I just anecdote, but I think it's interesting. So about inclusivity. Not so long ago, we had a brief. So we were doing a study for feasibility, and part of it was a box center. You say that in English, right? To box. And the brief was asking, so they've got this kind of brief made by the public entity where they put a lot of the things that needs to be there, like, okay, you have to think about the feasibility of the project, and you have to take into account the question of sustainability, the question of a lot of things like that, and among them, inclusivity. And we took it rather serious because one of the guy in the office, he's fighting for queer, and I'm a bit involved. So we kind of spent a bit of time on that. And it's not so easy to kind of come on in a box center about what you could do to really try to change. So one of the things we thought was it would be good to have changing rooms for babies, both in the women toilet and the man, and also places to put the stroller and things like that. So it was not a lot because these are things we saw in other documentation, and we thought, yes, that's good. So we put some of this element in it, and then we send in the feasibility studies, and we were rather happy to have been at least able to put a bit of it in it. And we received a remark from the public, the commune, who came back and said, yeah, but you wrote that, but it's totally meaningless. Why do you ask that? Well, just kind of senseless to prescribe to have changing room in men's WC. That's and we kind of were very shocked because we realized, well, actually they asked it in their brief, but they're not prepared to receive an answer. And then so we had to fight for that very tiny little things. But I think that the fact that they put it in the brief, it's already better. This is not something that would have happened 30 years ago when I started.
Yeah.
You would never receive, you would never receive a brief asking about that. People would say, what does that word mean, inclusivity? It means nothing. At least now, even if they're not prepared to have an answer, it starts to, and we had a conversation about that. So it's a progress, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems a progress, but it's also worrying maybe if it's more like you said, a fashionable way of having. You cannot go around this. You have to do this. So you have to mention that things have to be inclusive. But then, of course, this has a lot of.
Do you really want to have an answer? Of course,
Yeah,
that's sure.
Yeah. Just to come back a bit to Bureau Bouwtechniek you were talking about. You told me when we talked before, and I was so happy to hear something like that. Do you know of other, because we're trying to have these conversations, of course, more in all of the sector. I know also now NAV is trying to engage offices in these discussions. But I hadn't heard before this because the process is very office focused, very specific.
Yeah, of course.
It's really to develop a change
within the office.
Within the office. So can you say a bit more about this? How this came about?
Yeah, I mean, I think because when I think of the work that I like to do, it didn't come just from one day to another. I think the first step that you have to do is to talk about it. And I always have a big mouth. I say what I think. And those kind of topics are really dear to my heart because of course I have the fact that I know what racism is, and because I know what racism is, I know what exclusion is, so I know what it is to also be excluded for other reasons. I don't have the experience, but I can relate to it. So that's always something that I, if you start to know me as a friend, you know that I talk a lot about those kind of questions: sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia. All those kind of talks, I just put them there on the table. And the first time you talk about it, most of the time, it's anger that you get from people. Because I think people don't like to think that they are bad people. Because I think the first time that you start to talk about those questions, people maybe think that they are bad. But I said that, but I didn't mean it. Of course you didn't mean it, but it comes from somewhere. So it was a long process. They were with the people in the office, friends, talking. And at some point, people get mature enough to then understand what inclusivity is and that they need to take action for it. I think, I really love Jos tonight. I mean, I didn't know her. I mean, I discovered a really inspiring woman. I mean, she said it as well. It's all about talking about it, make sure that people start to understand what it is, and then take action for it. But also to understand that it's not because you're not a woman that feminism is not your problem.
Yeah, because now you instigated something which, according to what you just said about the questionnaire and the results, a lot of the women in the firm might be really glad about, because some things can change for them, because it seemed that there were things.
Of course, and I think it's also about the fact to also come together and to realize first, my experience is not the only one. I'm not the only one thinking that. That's really important. It's empowerment. And then it's also a way to tell the other people, the people that doesn't experience the problem, that there is a problem. Because most of the time it's always about numbers. You know, I mean, but it's one problem. It's not really a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, and we also talked in the first event. I can remember someone sharing also talking a lot in her office about these themes, and also having the experience that then she as a person is becoming the problem, because she is always talking about these topics, and this is also a lot of hard work, of course.
That's an experience that I have everywhere where I come.
Yeah,
I'm most of the time the problem at the beginning.
Let's move on to you, Somaie. You, as I just mentioned, you chose to move, to change from sectors. You left architecture sector and went to work in the healthcare sector. Can you talk a bit more on what your reasons were to make the shift?
Well, first of all, I have to start by my studies. I had always these struggles with my studies from the beginning. Like, I like architecture, I like history, philosophy, like the theoretically subjects and courses a lot. And also like the urban planning, focusing on our environment, how is the environment built, and who's relating to the like public spaces and so on. But on the other side, I had my weakness at the technical side, so it was never, you had to go through it. My favorite, let's say, and the architecture practice showed me in my internship that this is the reality. Like most of the time, drawing, like these technical drawings, and less thinking about like who are you, for who are you building, like also behind the screen. And while I'm a very social person and I like to meet people, and I believe in participatory approaches and work with people, like the future users of, let's say, public spaces. So I miss this kind of context, and it was double, like the feeling